care because privacy is a basic human right. How many more princes and his wives have to live in this nightmare?
Well, I mean, how do you recover from that? I don't know how you can recover from that. When South Park decides that it's your turn to be beat publicly with comedy and everybody is standing around laughing at you, I just don't see how you come back from this. I don't see how you make it okay now. I cannot think of one thing that they can come out and say and turn the public tide towards them. The days of them squeezing out sympathy from even the most doe-eyed innocent who has no idea their manipulative ways, those days are over. Even the person who wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt, the person who was really buying into their story of racism, the person who believed every sad, sorry story of victimization, even that person is now like, these people are a little bit self-consumed. Yeah. I mean, the rest of us have known that for a while, but thank you, South Park, for making that quite evident to the, people on the fringes who still hadn't quite gathered enough information to realize that Meghan Markle and Prince Harry are some of the most repugnant, ridiculous, offensive, self-consumed, narcissistic sad sacks that this country has ever known. And we've had our share of narcissists up in this place. But these two, I feel like, will go down in history as just a couple of the most pathetic individuals. And I think another thing that is just so gross about them is just how old they are to be acting this way. But good on South Park for being like, these people need to be called out. Because that's, I guess that's what it takes. There's so many celebrities, like, when South Park comes after you and nails your coffin shut, there's no climbing back out. Well, good luck, Harry and Meghan, after that. In this episode, we are following up after the situation in Vegas, in which he invited a couple of dodgy girls upstairs from the blackjack tables and then was like, hey, how come I couldn't trust him? This guy shows such a wanton lack of common sense. I mean, where's his street smarts? I don't feel like you need to have grown up on the streets of Mumbai to have figured out how to get through the world with just a little bit of common sense. But he is over there wondering why in the world it went south when he was in Las Vegas, one of the biggest party cities in the world. He let up a couple of randos into his room who he did not know. He did not trust them. And then he decides that, hey, I think a great idea right now would be for me to just take all my clothes off. This is going to end up great. I'm so glad I'm having a good time. I'm so glad I can just, let loose and be free. I'm just so glad that, I can party like an animal and there's just never going to be any repercussions to that, Harry's problem, and it's going to become really evident in today's reading, is he doesn't seem to possess the ability to see around corners. I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a psychologist, but what I can tell you is, like, anybody reading this book is like, oh wow, if I didn't know what Arrested Development was, I just found out from reading this book. He's no older than he was when his mother died, and it seems like all of his mental capabilities stopped at the same time. So he doesn't seem to possess the ability to see around corners and to predict what might happen in predictable situations. So the rest of us are going like, wait, why did you do that? And he's like shocked at the outcome time and time again. And that's what surprised me so much about this book. Is just, I'm shocked by how often he is shocked. And he is truly blown away. But then I'm like, are you really blown away? Or are you just trying to act like you're surprised to, like, maybe create buy-in with us? Like, well, yeah, that is kind of a weird situation. Like, I can't believe that you would invite in a couple of strangers and they'd take some pictures of your naked butt, and sell them to TMZ. That is kind of crazy. It's like, is he trying to, like, manipulate us into agreeing that it was a wild situation? I don't know, but you know what? I'm not manipulatable. Okay, so he transitions from that story. He says he went home and it turned out fine. In the end, everyone was so supportive of his nakedness. And, around the world, soldiers began taking pictures of themselves, covering up their area with, like, a helmet or whatever. All in solidarity, Prince Harry. So, and he wants you to know that Cressida was not upset with him, okay? So he might have been wilding out in Vegas, but him and his girlfriend are tight, okay? So just note that. By the way, from now on, he calls her Cress, so that's what I'll be doing. And anyway, so before we get into the bulk of today, which is all about him flying helicopters. I think it's hilarious that he keeps trying to tell us that he was a pilot, yet none of the stories in which he is in the plane is he flying. He keeps acting like the reason he didn't fly is because the guy with him was a little bit more experienced. So like out of the generosity of his heart, he allowed that guy to take the reins. Okay, well. But before we get into this, if you are enjoying these videos, if you are liking the content, please comment, like, subscribe, share with a friend if you think it's something that they would think is amusing. This book is coming to a close, so we're going to have to decide what we want to do next. I'm probably going to do another read along because what I wanted to do on this channel was to always have a read along, always have a book that we're doing, but then also throw in some videos that just comment on stuff that's in the news. So I'm going to be putting out a few of those here and there. We'll still have spare. We are more than I'm like 99% sure we're going to do Revenge next. So if you're here for the royal news, don't worry, there's still always going to be royal news. But I also would love to talk about some other things too. So stay tuned. If you have been enjoying this commentary, but you're kind of getting a little sick of spare, aren't we all? Don't worry, there's more stuff coming. So, and if you have a friend who you think would enjoy political and social commentary from somebody who just is going to say it like it is, feel free to share this channel with them. Okay, back to our episode. Okay, so Harry in this episode is talking all about him and his helicopters. And you guys know how much I despise all of the Afghanistan talk. It's just so much nonsense. It's just so much trash. I think the thing is that, as I've said before, when Harry writes about being in the military, he is like, you know what he's like? He is like a homeschooled 14-year-old whose very conservative parents have finally allowed him to watch Saving Private Ryan. And now he's all jacked up on secondhand adrenaline, and he decides he's gonna sit down and write something because now he knows some stuff. That's the way this whole war section plays out. Him and all his little terms and all his little words and all this. So I'm going to kind of zip through this section pretty quickly. I did not find it all that interesting, mostly because it's just him bragging a lot about what kind of a soldier he was and how accurate he was, and in the helicopter, and like how shooting people is the same as playing with his PlayStation. And you know, he makes that analogy and then he's super offended when everybody's like, wait, you're saying that shooting people is like playing a game on PlayStation? You know, so again, there's gonna be more blaming. So we're going to zip through this section like lightning fast. So this probably won't be one of my longer videos because we just got to get through this. I just want to get to part 3 when he meets Megan. Okay. So he says that he gets home, he talks to Cress about what happened. She's not mad at him. He brags about the fact that none of his bodyguards got in trouble, but also it's because he didn't tell anybody what had actually happened and that they had been right there when he was stripping and, you know, gyrating for the masses. It was all fine in the end, and really he couldn't think too much about it because now it's time for him to go to Afghanistan. And he says everybody was real jittery, but not him, because getting in the airplane to go and fly to Afghanistan was a homegoing for him. It was him going home. Okay, I mean, like, then you weren't experiencing what everyone else was experiencing. If flying to a war zone is a homecoming for you, then you were exceptionally sheltered the last time you were there. Okay, so he says it's a homegoing. He wants to let you know he's been promoted as a captain. Also, he's excited because this time he gets to fly with the other soldiers, so he's not just, you know, in that, like, hiding in that little bunkhouse behind the cockpit. But now he writes, this time I was allowed to sit with all the other soldiers to feel part of a team. And I circled the word feel. Isn't that interesting that even he knows he isn't? You get to feel like one of the soldiers. Well, aren't you one? I don't know. It's almost like he knows that there's a differentiation. Also, by the way, his bodyguards are with him this time. So at least he's admitting this time that they were there. He says, now both my bodyguards were coming. Because unlike my last tour of duty, I had bodyguards this time. Mainly because there were proper accommodations for them. And because they could blend in. I was living with thousands of others. Well, you were too before, weren't you? Well, I guess he was, in that outposting place. But, for him to act like he had no one watching him, please, no one believes it. Then he talks a lot about what would happen when, as an Apache pilot, what they would do while they were waiting to be called into service. So they basically just sat around in this tent, drank a lot of coffee, played a lot of video games, looked at a lot of porn magazines, apparently. It's like, what are you looking at that for? With everybody? What is that? And he just does a lot of annoying talk like, I felt naked. I had my 9mm, but my SA-80A was locked up. I had my bodyguards, but I needed my Apache. That's the only place I'd feel safe and useful. I needed to rain down fire on our attackers, whoever they were. So he's talking about a time in which there was some sort of, imminent threat. And, he was waiting to go and rain down fire on his attackers. Well, one time that in that same episode, everyone's freaking out. They don't know what's going to happen. But apparently what had happened to cause the disturbance, there had been a couple of Taliban fighters who'd got a hold of American uniforms and cut a hole in the fence and had slipped in. And they'd cut a hole in the fence to get to Prince Harry. They said they were looking for him. And, he says, the Taliban actually issued a statement. Prince Harry was our target, and the date of the attack had been carefully chosen as well. They timed it, they proclaimed, to coincide with my birthday. How dare that? What kind of a birthday gift is that? I didn't know if I believed that. I didn't want to believe it. But one thing was beyond dispute. The Taliban had learned about my presence on the base and the granular details of my tour through the nonstop coverage that week in the British press. What is the British press supposed to talk about? There is a war going on and their prince happens to be there. I think that they might make mention of it from time to time. And it isn't as though they've got some, they don't have some rat from within giving your specific global coordinates. I mean, there's no way that their press coverage informed the Taliban. So why are you always making these dumb connections that couldn't possibly be true? He talks more about he talks a lot about sitting in that tent. He uses all his little words, all his little acronyms. TIC, troops in contact. He doesn't call air conditioning, it's aircon. As a person from the South who has had air conditioning in my home most of the year, I can tell you nobody has ever referred to it as aircon. Okay? I don't know who refers to air conditioning as aircon. Maybe our Aussie friends who always have fun little words, but for the rest of us, we don't say aircon. But, it's just him using his little words. But he talks about something that happens in this chapter, or in this section of readings, is he makes a lot of references every time his grandmother is brought up, every time Queen Elizabeth is brought up. He writes about her as though she's just kind of this like little old fuddy-duddy, funny little old lady. As he's talking about sitting in that tent, there was a red phone that was positioned. It didn't have any buttons on it or anything. It was just the phone and the cradle, and you'd pick it up when it rang, and they would tell you where you were going to go. And then he's like, the alarm itself was a phone. Red, plain, no buttons, no dial, just a base and handset. Its ringer was antique, consummately British. Bring! The sound was vaguely familiar. I couldn't place it at first. Eventually, I realized it was exactly like Granny's phone at Sandringham on her big desk, in the huge sitting room where she took calls between games of bridge. Like she's just this old lady just playing bridge, I just don't know, like, it's just these like little phrases where it's just like he's just kind of throwing some vague disrespect. Like, why did he have to bring her up into it? It's just like he just wants to be overly familiar about her to us. Like, I get to say that she's just kind of like this old lady who like plays bridge and stuff. Like sometimes takes an important call from time to time. I just can't with him. He tells us about his co-pilot, Dave, who was really a skilled individual, far more skilled than he, because he'd been there for 3 tours already. You can imagine where Dave's mental state was. He says that he was hard for him with Dave because Dave's sense of humor was difficult to understand. He said that Dave, he could never understand if Dave was being funny, if he was being sarcastic, if he was being serious. I can assure you Dave was being serious 100% of the time. He goes on this long jag about how every time they flew in the helicopter, they were really heavy because they had all these 30mm rounds and, you know, a lot of stuff. And how he resented the feeling of being pulled down to earth when all he wanted to do was to just go rain down fire on the attackers. And he talks about how at one point they lifted off. The light was flashing that they needed to land because they were too heavy. And he says that, then I thought, maybe we could just ignore the warning light. Okay, if your Apache helicopter is warning you to land because you're too heavy, I don't think you just get to ignore that. I mean, but isn't that just so indicative of the way he's lived his life? Warning lights going all over the place, and he just plows on. Like, I don't really think there's much of a consequence here. I don't think it really matters. I don't think it's that big of a deal. Okay. And he says that Dave, you know, thank God for Dave. Dave's like, we're landing. So Dave turns back around and goes back to the base. And he says that, fine, you know, Dave was a more experienced flyer. He says he'd already done 3 tours. He knew all about those warning lights. Some you could ignore. They blinked all the time. You pulled out the fuses to shut them up, but not this one. Okay, but presumably you had like 2 years learning how to fly this thing, and you think that you can ignore the light that tells you, hey, you better land because you're too heavy and you're going to crash if you don't? Like, he's over there thinking that you could ignore that light? But it goes, this is the thing that was really like, oh my gosh, you petulant child. I felt cheated. I wanted to go. I was willing to risk crashing, being taken prisoner, whatever. Do you not understand what would happen to you if you crashed? Taken prisoner? What are you talking about? You want to just gamble? Not only with your life, but also with Dave's life? I just wanted to go. The silly little light was blinking telling me I better land, but I didn't want to. I need to go. Go straight into the pits of hell. Let's see, what else does he say? He talks about you couldn't find the Taliban. They're really hard to find. Yeah, okay. Well, it is guerrilla warfare, so imagine that. Then he goes on to tell us that he was the first in his squadron to pull his trigger in anger. That doesn't seem like something I'd want to brag about. He says that it was always really frustrating because they'd get a sight, they'd see the Taliban, they would confirm that it was indeed Taliban, it wasn't any civilians, it wasn't anybody that they, on their side, or on our side, or on the American side, they could confirm, then they'd call in for permission, and those jokers would never come back with permission in a timely fashion. So he goes on and on about, you know, if everybody else was as fast and as quick as I was, so finally I just had to pull the trigger and kill someone. And he says the first time that he killed somebody and knew that he'd killed somebody because the Apache they recorded every kill. So you'd go and then you'd come back and you'd watch the kill footage and, you know, confirm that it had been done. The first time he did it, he came in and he did a mental scan. I'd been in combat before. I'd killed before. But this was the most direct contact with the enemy ever. In other engagements, it felt impersonal. This one was eyes on target, finger on trigger, fire away. And I asked myself how I felt. Traumatized? No. Sad? No. Surprised? No. Prepared in a way. Doing my job, what we're trained for. Okay, so he goes on to like be scared if he's getting callous and desensitized, but then he's like, no, it's my job. Simple maths. They're the bad guys, we're the good guys. Okay, you know, I got no problems with him saying that because that is the way of war. Okay, you get all caught up in what it is that you're killing another human being. Okay, you can't do your job. Okay, so I'm fine if that's what he has to say. But what if he'd stopped there and maybe not told us so much about when he like killed the guy, it just seems like dangerous to talk that much about what you were up to and putting your name on certain kills. And like they know when you were there, they know what region you were in. Just seems dangerous to be maybe letting the enemy know, even at this late date, what you were up to, because it's not like the Taliban has been conquered. I mean, who knows what they could be up to. And, you know, and of course we're going to hit the part in the book where he does his famous telling us about the 25. It just wasn't necessary. It wasn't necessary to the story. He really could have told all of this in much vaguer terms than he does. But it just comes across as so much bragging. And it's just unbecoming to a soldier to speak that way, because it like you do what you have to do, but you don't have callous disregard for the lives that you did have to take by just talking about it like it's just no thing. I don't know. It just doesn't seem like a classy move to me. Oh, but this is the thing that I was like, okay, I'm going to file this into things that did not happen. He says that he was always really aggressive with these Taliban, and you know, they rode around on these motorbikes, and you know, he'd be flying over them and going after them, and you know, getting them in his sights, and you know, just knocking the motorbike right out from underneath them and killing them in the road. And he says that much later, speaking about it with a mate, he asked, "Did it factor into your feelings that these killers were on motorbikes, the chosen vehicle of paps around the world?" Honestly, could I honestly say that while chasing a pack of motorbikes, not one particle of me was thinking about the pack of motorbikes that chased one Mercedes into a Paris tunnel? Or the packs of motorbikes that chased me 1,000 times? I couldn't say. Okay, your male friend didn't ever sit you down and be like, "Dude, you ever think about the fact that those Taliban are on motorbikes and so are the paps? You ever think about that? Make that connection, man? That's deep." No guy ever said that to you. No guy would ever even think of that. You know who asked him that question? The real person who asked him that question was Meghan Markle, trying to get into his head and make him see connections and reopen the mummy wound. That's who asked him that question, but he couldn't say that. So he said, a mate said, you know, mate asked him. No, he didn't. That is so much BS. I can't even stand it. I mean, motorbikes are the way a lot of people in a lot of countries travel, okay? It's got nothing to do with paps. So if you cannot get your mind out of that world of paparazzi and your mom and all this, then you are not in a state of mind to be sitting as the gunner in an Apache helicopter. Just, you know, just my random opinion, but, you know. He goes on, like every single one of these chapters about, and then I killed this guy, and then I killed that guy, and then I circled around and killed another guy. It's just like, you don't have to tell us every time it happened. You really don't. For your safety and others, I would advise against it. And he says here, he makes this analogy for us, which he's later going to be offended at anybody for noticing that he made the analogy. But he says that when he was up in the helicopter and it was his job to be taking people out while Dave was flying, he says, "The thumbstick I fired was remarkably similar to the thumbstick for the PlayStation game I had just been playing. The missile hit just short of the motorbike's spokes. Textbook. Exactly what I've been taught to aim. Too high, you might send it over the top of his head. Too low, you take out nothing but dirt and sand. Delta Hotel. Direct hit." Delta Hotel, please. Nobody knows what that means. So he just finished saying that in his mind, it was so much like playing video games. Later on, he'll say something similar to a journalist who is like, "Oh, wow, that seems a little calloused." And then he was offended at them for thinking it was calloused. Okay, well, that is probably how you had to think about it. You couldn't think about it as another human being. We could get that. We can understand that. We're not so against you that we can't understand the, you know, sort of the mental place you had to be, the mental gymnastics you need to do in order to kill another human being in a war zone. Okay. But you don't need to get all mad at us, for you said it first. We didn't say it, you did. He goes on about how there was this guy who would run their debriefings after they got done in the helicopter, and, you know, they'd have to watch the tape and see, like, okay, how did you do? And, you know, what can you improve on? And he says he's convinced that this guy that was in charge was just super jealous because he'd never been in an Apache helicopter. He wasn't a gunner, so he just didn't know how it was, and so he was always trying to degrade Harry's efforts. Total jealousy. That guy was just so eaten up with jealousy. You know, his opinion was next to dirt because, you know, he couldn't see straight. He was just, you know, because of the green-eyed monster. He said the guy was always trying to provoke them, always trying to get in their heads. I'm like, Why would he do that? He's trying to make you better, okay? So I know you think that you're awesome thanks to all your PlayStation games, and that's really helped you. But, this guy's job, his task is to run you through what you just did and help you and give you some helpful criticism. Harry has never in his whole life understood some helpful criticism. He would never take it. Something that he says that I think is, again, showing some more of his inability to self-examine. He said that the squadron commander, the one who was tasked with walking them through the film, had an execrable attitude, which I think is ridiculous for him to say that. But he was exploiting a real and legitimate fear that we all had during these debriefs, a fear we all shared. Afghanistan was a war of mistakes, a war of enormous collateral damage, thousands of innocents killed and maimed, and that always haunted us. So my goal from the day I arrived was never to go to bed doubting that I'd done the right thing, that my targets had been correct, that I was firing on Taliban and only Taliban, no civilians nearby. I wanted to return to Britain with all my limbs, but more I wanted to go home with my conscience intact, which meant being aware of what I was doing and why I was doing it at all times. So he's annoyed because he says his squadron commander was always putting seeds of doubt into his mind about whether what he had done had been correct, whether what he had done had put other people's lives in danger, basically making him undermine his own decision making, which he resented. But what I think is interesting is that he says he wanted to return to Britain with all his limbs, but more he wanted to go home with his conscience intact. Well, how's his conscience now? I'd like to know. Shredded, I wouldn't wonder. I mean, he can take shots at his family all day long, but God forbid he make a wrong shot from an Apache helicopter down at the Taliban. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like he's so concerned about preserving his conscience. But how does he live with himself now? Now that he's taken shot after shot after shot, not at an enemy, but at his own family. Not at an allied force, but at his own flesh and blood. What's wrong with this person? Immediately following that passage, she talks about how, because everything was filmed, he knows exactly how many people he killed. Exactly. And that number doesn't mean a whole lot to him, but in case you want to know, it's 25, so. No, he didn't want to know, and you shouldn't have told us. And I'm not going to beat a dead horse. Everybody has freaked out that he told he told the world how many Taliban he had killed. But that is dangerous. What was he thinking? What was he thinking? More importantly, what was his publicist thinking? Why did they allow that number to be printed? Why did they allow this whole chapter, by the way? Because apart from the fact that, hey, that's not info we need, it's so boring. It's so boring. I was trying to read last night. This was me in the bed. I just kept falling asleep. It's just so dull. Oh gosh, finally it's over. He says that he was totally able to make his peace with everybody he'd killed. One of the things that sort of haunted him was when he wasn't able to swoop in and help when he wanted to and when he needed to, and when, there were people who were relying on him and he couldn't get the okay in time. But I mean, that wasn't on him. It was on those jokers who could never answer the phone. So just note that. Then he says it was time to go home and he had to have an obligatory exit interview. And the guy was just a total joker, real annoying. He asked about, he asked Harry, had he killed anyone? Harry's like, well, yeah, it's a war zone, so. Put two and two together, Joker. I mean, what do you think? What are you even asking me? What a loser. And, he says, he tells the reporter that he thinks the British press is a bunch of crap. He's really annoyed that they keep reporting on his brother and sister-in-law because they just announced that they're having a baby. And he's like, they keep talking about it. Let those two have their baby in peace. Okay, if the press decides to run a story about how excited they are for William and Kate, how is that wrecking their peace? It's just public support for, the new baby. Of course I was going to bother Harry because now he's no longer the spare. But, he says that he told the reporter that his dad had told him to quit reading the papers. And he says he felt guilty every time he did because it made him complicit. If he doesn't want the press to always be in his face, then, and he doesn't want to support them, then why is he reading it? I mean, even he can see that that's pretty dumb. But, you sit down with somebody and tell them, I think your job is a bunch of BS. I think you have the worst job in the world. I think you are part of the problem. Do you think that that person's going to go and write a piece that's just glowing on you? I mean, a mature journalist probably could do it, but I mean, I don't know. It would still be hard to write about it to write about Harry in a super positive way if when you sit down with him, he just denigrates you as a human being in your profession. Then he says that as they were leaving, they stopped in Cyprus for a decompression, what the army called a decompression. Basically, you could have like a cold beer, and they took them to a comedy show. But he says that like none of the guys were really like quite ready for that yet, So, they drank their beer and watched the show rather steely-eyed, and it was just kind of hard to acclimate, he says. And this is where he talks about how the article came out that from the interview he just had, and in which the journalist had noted that he compared killing to video games, and Harry was super offended about that. But it's like, yeah, but you just did it for all of us. I mean, you said it. I mean, I can't say any more about that. Then he talks about when it was time to go home. He texted Cress, told her he was home. She texted back that she was relieved. Oh, thank God, you're here. But when they met up, she was like kind of taken aback by him, and he didn't really know what it was. Everyone said that he sounded different, and he's like, I don't feel different, so I don't know what y'all's problem is. And he says when he saw Cress like a week later after texting her saying he was home, she showed up at a party with his cousin Eugenie, and he said he hugged them both and he saw shock on their faces. And they said that he looked like a completely different person. Stockier, bigger, older. Yeah, all that. But also something else they couldn't name. But whatever it was, it seemed to frighten or was off-putting to Cress. And so they agreed, therefore, that it wasn't a reunion. It couldn't be. Can't have a reunion with someone you don't know. If we wanted to keep seeing each other, and I certainly did, we'd have to start again. Hello, I'm Cress. Hello, I'm Haz. Nice to meet you. Okay, he was there for like a hot second. How much different was he? And I mean, he goes on and on about the fact that it wasn't even a big thing as far as him killing people. I mean, he never felt guilty about that for 1 second. Big whoop. It's what had to be done. So I'm not really sure what mantle of shame he's wearing for having done his job, or if it's just one of those things where as a human being, you can't do certain activities without it getting all over you, whether you're aware of that or not. It could be that. But anyway, he says that he was fine. He didn't understand what they were going on about. He says that he just was bored to tears, though, at this point in his life, because before he'd had a mission when he was in Afghanistan, and now he just doesn't have anything to do. He goes and does his work, but it's just all pointless. He's just so bored. He keeps being like, can I please go back? And they're like, oh, no. And so finally the palace gives him a job. They say they're going to send him on a tour to America, which he is a little bit worried about because the last time he was there, he took his clothes off. And so he's like, I don't know if I should do that. But the palace was like, no, you go, because we want you to do a lot of talk about the war. It's a good world tour. We want you to promote the rehabilitation of wounded British and American soldiers. This is your thing, having been there. All of your charities are all about helping the wounded. And so this, make it a good thing. Doesn't have to be a bad thing. Doesn't have to be echoes of Vegas. Make it a good thing. So he's like, oh, okay. He says that he goes, he said that in May 2013, he was, the Hurricane Sandy had hit the Upper East Coast. And so he was walking along with New Jersey Mayor Chris Christie. And he said that the governor gifted him a blue fleece, which the press spun as his way of keeping me clothed. Actually, and this to me is just such an, it's such an unfortunate job for no reason. I mean, I don't have any feelings one way or the other about Chris Christie, but I just don't think that this is I don't think this needed to be said. It just seems kind of mean. He says, actually, Christie spun it that way. A reporter asked him what he thought of my time in Vegas, and Christie vowed that if I spent the whole day with him, nobody's gonna get naked. That line got a big laugh because Christie is famously stout. You didn't need to explain the joke to us. But why do you gotta call him fat? And they just moves on. He's like, that old fatty over there. Like, it was funny because he was fat, you know, so like nobody wants to see him naked. Not like when I got naked. Talks about how he went to DC, visited with Barack Obama and his wife. Okay, so while he is there, it's a super whirlwind tour. It was only 5 days, and he's like crisscrossing the country. While he was there, though, he went to Colorado, and in Colorado, he witnessed something called the Warrior Games, and it was a kind of Olympiad for wounded soldiers. And there was 200 men and women taking part, and each of them really inspired him because even though they were very wounded, they had found a way to still progress in life and meet goals despite their wounds. In fact, the very amputations that they had is what made them so pronounceably respected, because like here they hadn't let the thing hold them back, and look what they're able to do, even though, you know. So he was very inspired, and especially because he at this time was feeling without a goal, to see somebody who had made much of themselves despite their limitations, it was inspiring to him. And he thought, how can I make this happen in England? So he wrote up a proposal. He says, I guarantee you he didn't, but anyway, he got somebody who could do it, and he told them, he went to the Royal Foundation Board, which was in charge of him, William, and Kate's charities. They had $7 million in the coffers. And so he went to them and he's like, look, I have something I want to do. And he told them all about what he was interested in. He gave them their pitch. He says he didn't do a very good job pitching it because he was really nervous, but happy day, they said yes. So he was feeling like really elated that here his dream of coming up with an answer to the American Warrior Games was being taken on as a project. And he says that he was thrilled when the board said yes, and he reached out to Willie, expecting him to be thrilled as well. But of course he wasn't. He was sorely irritated. He wished I'd run all this by him first. My assumption, I said, was that other people had done so. Well, I thought everybody else was going to do that for me, just like they do everything else. Okay, well, how was I supposed to know that for once somebody wasn't going to pick up every little piece after me? He complained that I'd be using up all the funds in the Royal Foundation. That's absurd, I spluttered. I was told only £500,000 grant would be needed to get the games going. That's a fraction of the foundation's money. And besides, it was coming from the Endeavor Fund, an arm of the foundation I created specifically for veterans recovery. The rest would come from donors and sponsors. What was going on here, I wondered. Then I realized, my God, it's sibling rivalry. I put a hand over my eyes. Had we not got past this yet? The whole Aaron versus the spare thing? Wasn't it a bit late in the day for that tired childhood dynamic? But even if it wasn't, even if Willie insisted on being competitive, on turning our brotherhood into some kind of private Olympiad, hadn't he built up an insurmountable lead? He was married with a baby while I was eating takeaway alone over the sink. That does sound pretty pathetic. Pa's sink! I still lived with Pa! Game over, man. You win. Okay, well, that's pretty pathetic. In the next section, he talks all about how he's having panic attacks and the PTSD is setting in for real. He said that he was starting to avoid going out. He was avoiding places with loud noise or anytime that there was too many people. He said everywhere he went, he just was like feeling hot and flushed and like just drenched in sweat. Every time he had to get up and put his suit on every day, he would just start freaking out. He goes off on this weird aside, again, pulling Granny into it, just making her seem like a crazy old lady with a bunch of dogs. He says that he had always been sensitive to heat, and would sweat really easily, but now it's like it didn't matter what the environment was. He was just always sweating like he was in a desert. And he says that I'd always been sensitive to heat, like Pa. He and I would joke about it. We're not made for this world, we said. Bloody snowmen. The dining room at Sandringham, for instance, was our version of Dante's Inferno. Much of Sandringham was balmy, but the dining room was subtropical. Pa and I'd always wait for Granny to look away, and then one of us would jump up and sprint to the window and crack it an inch. Ah, blessed cool air. But the corgis always betrayed us. The cool air made them whimper, and Granny would say, "Is there a draft?" And a footman would promptly shut the window. That loud thump, unavoidable because the windows were so old, it always felt like the door of a jail cell being slammed. But not every time I was about to make any kind of a public appearance, no matter the venue, felt like that Sandringham dining room. So there he is, another one of his sorry little tales about how Granny just bless the old bat. You know, it's just always these little asides. You know, it's not like he has denigrated her, just ripped her up one side and down the other. Although there was that one time when he was like calling her a bad mom, which I thought was unfair. But, you know, just these little like, oh, Granny and her corgis, you know, is there a draft? I just don't like the way he acts. But he says he didn't do anything except sit around all day, Googling his symptoms and watching Friends. And that I think is where we're going to end. He, in the next section, because this video is getting really long, but in the next section, he's going to talk about how he has a friend who was also, I think, suffering from some PTSD, who it turned out to, or it was just like having a hard time mentally. Who it was, remember his friend Henners, who was killed in a car accident, running an errand. He wasn't even going fast, but then he lost control of the car and it hit a tree and then he died. Well, Henner's brother Thomas, I think, is also struggling with some mental health stuff. And so I think he and Harry are going to get together and maybe help each other out. All right. That was a slog, you guys. Some of these videos are really fun to do, like last time. And some of these videos are just like, oh my gosh, this guy is the worst. But like I said earlier, you know, we are going to finish Spare. We're going to have another read along with Revenge, most likely. But there's going to be other stuff on this channel too. And we can't just always talk about these people. I know we all enjoy it. But, you know, at a certain point, we've just got to talk about some other stuff, okay? And I'm here for that. So be on the lookout for a few videos sprinkled out through the week that are just going to talk about, like, real short videos. Nothing long format like this, but little short videos about just stuff that's in the news. And I'm like, well, that's interesting. Why did they say that? You know, so enjoy. It was good to see you. I will see you later this week. This video came out late and there's supposed to be another one coming out tomorrow. So anyway, you might get 2 videos this weekend. Hopefully, because this video was the worst. I'll see you guys later. Bye.